welcome to The Firm. On the show this week,
is it just telecom companies, or can the Comptroller and Auditor General of India now audit all businesses where the government has a revenue share? Why Jitendra Bhargav failed, and when can a third party appeal against a CCI order?
our top story. This week, the Supreme Court said that it is the duty of the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, CAG or CAG, to audit all transactions of the Union and State, as also to audit all receipts payable to the Consolidated Fund of India. And hence the Apex Court ruled that CAG's examination of the accounts of private telecom service providers in a revenue sharing contract is extremely important to ascertain whether there is an unlawful gain to the service provider and an unlawful loss to the union. Is it just telecom companies that can now be audited by CAG, or does the application of this judgment extend to all situations where the government has a revenue share? Well, to discuss the scope and enforcement of this order, I'm joined today by Rajiv Oberoi of IDFC and Vikram Nankani of ELP. Gentlemen, to both of you, a very warm welcome. Does this apply only to telecom companies, or will this apply to a wide variety of public-private partnership projects or any other business that has any form of revenue share with the government? What do you say, Mr. Oberoi?
Any kind of a revenue which is coming to the state through any contractual obligation of any concession is subject to the review of CAG.
That's a very wide impact, Vikram. Do you read it as Mr. Oberoi reads it? That's one question. And if you can, in your answer, also tell me whether there needs to be the involvement of a natural resource. And the reason I ask this is because the front part of this Supreme Court order dwells in great detail on how spectrum is a natural resource, and therefore, you know, the distribution of this natural resource in a manner which benefits the public is what the Constitution requires. So does there have to be a natural resource nexus?
I agree with Rajiv that it is actually cases where there are any receipts to the union government or the state government that will come under the purview of the Supreme Court order. Because remember, they were looking at section 16 of the CAG Act, which empowers the CAG to look into the accounts of the union where the receipts. So as long as there are receipts into the Consolidated Fund of India coming from any sector they may be, either under a concession agreement or under a boot policy or any form of licensing arrangement, that would be subject to CAG as per the Supreme Court order. Coming to the second part of your question, whether this would impact only those cases where there are national resources or not. According to me, no. That is an overarching consideration, of course, in the order, because it says that we are dealing with spectrum, which is a natural resource. But that's not the limiting factor of the judgment. So it could apply even to cases where there are non-natural resources of the government.
Like a road concession.
Like a road concession, absolutely right. Because, again, to remind ourselves, Section 16 does not limit it only to natural resources or national resources. 16 talks of receipts to the union, and that's unqualified. Now, if you strictly therefore apply the Supreme Court judgment, it will apply regardless of what the resources that we are dealing with.
Okay. If you are a business that's in business with the government, you can be audited by CAG. Is that a fair way to say it?
The common understanding which all of us had was that if you are government, you are subject to a CAG audit. And if you were a government company, more than 51% shares held by the government, then you were subject to a CAG audit, otherwise you are not. But having said that, this order takes credence on Article 266 also, which basically says that if there is any revenue receipt coming to the Consolidated Fund of India, then the CAG, getting its power under Article 148, read with Section 16 of the CAG Act, will be subject to the audit.
I want to add one nuance to that, and which is that, you know, in the order, in a place, the Supreme Court says the scope is to audit all transactions which the union and state have entered into, which has a nexus with the Consolidated Fund of India, especially when the receipts have direct connection with revenue sharing, right? Now, when they say nexus with Consolidated Fund of India, you know, revenue share is one thing, but nexus with Consolidated Fund of India can even go beyond revenue share.
Manika, I think to read that word nexus and try to let our imagination go.
So you're saying that this is only when it comes to revenue share.
That's right.
I would read it in a wider sense.
Okay.
And
What
generally-
all gets included then, which goes beyond the logic of, let's say, auditing, a situation where telecom has revenue share or a road concession or something like that?
Yes, let's say contractual payments to the government of India. Now, there are formulas in many concession agreements. How do you calculate the government's share of profits? You may call it profits, but still it's a receipt in the hands of the government. That would also be subject to CAG if this was to strictly apply. So I don't read it narrowly. I think this has opened up a wider gate for the industry to be concerned about. Unfortunately, there are no lines drawn as to where the CAG can say that this is where the power extends, because the moment you're talking about receipts, you're going to get into the back-end calculations of how those receipts are fairly arrived at.
Okay, I'm not sure if it's as open-ended as that, an audit, because, again, I'll refer back to what the order says, and I'll ask you both the question then, does this judgment seek to limit the scope of an audit by saying that CAG, in that process of auditing, is not actually auditing the accounts of the service providers as such, but examining all the receipts to ascertain whether the union is getting its due share by way of license fee, spectrum charges, which it is legitimately entitled to. By adopting that process, the CAG is not carrying out any statutory audit of the accounts of the service providers, but for the limited purpose of ascertaining whether the union is getting its legitimate share. Is that not then a limitation on how far the CAG audit can go?
In every agreement, it is always embedded that the concessionaire can look at the books of the account, and more so if he is sharing the revenues.
How far can that audit go? In the case of telecom service providers, it's adjusted gross revenue, right, which needs to be calculated in a certain fashion to ensure that the government is getting the right share.
Right.
So the CAG then is tasked only with ensuring that AGR is calculated and is accounted for in the right fashion. It doesn't go into all the other, areas of the audit. Would you understand it like that?
I totally agree, because the judgment clearly gives an examples that how AGR has to be calculated, and to what extent it can be calculated.
Right. So therefore, you would see this as a limit to the scope of the audit itself.
Absolutely.
Would that be fair?
I will write.
Vikram, you agree?
I am a little concerned.
Okay.
I think, how would you read words like due share, legitimate share, and when you have, and let's take AGR as one example, but you could multiply this across sectors like oil and gas and ports and airports, which Rajiv mentioned. Each of these formulas have got certain permissible deductions which are allowed. Each of these formulas have an inclusive definition to say what are the elements which will go into the top line. Now, in order for the CAG to come to the conclusion that government has got its due share or legitimate share, as the Supreme Court puts it, they would be entitled to go into each and every element of inclusion and deduction.
But I think already in this particular case, the rule 3 and 5 clearly defines that what kind of books you have to maintain, and also...
But that was in the case of telecom service providers.
I'm saying, so in most of the concessions, it is quite well defined. But having said that, maybe I'm jumping the gun, they will have to address this issue in their forthcoming concessions and bed it down and define. You can't have a relationship, you can't have an agreement which is open-ended.